wonderful to be here. I'm really honored to be invited. And I'm going to apologize beforehand to the folks at Foresight because I'm sure they wanted me to give a talk about all the interesting sort of examples and DAOs. And I'm going to admit, I specifically run an institute called MetaGov. And so I'm going to take this conversation at a slightly more meta level. So talking about organizing principles and how we think about governance, as opposed to maybe like digging down into all the examples. But hopefully we'll be able to dig it into some of those examples in the actual conversation. And also just like caveat, this is technically supposed to be 10 minutes, so I'm going to kind of jump through a whole lot of stuff. You guys can, but actually do feel free to interrupt me at any point. So yeah, I'm Josh. I'm a fellow at Stanford, working in digital civil society, as well as a PhD student at Oxford, where most of my work actually revolves around theoretical machine learning. And a co-founder of the MetaGovernance project, which is a group of different academics and researchers building standards in infrastructure for online governance. So the main point we're going to cover today is how can we support governance experimentation? And almost immediately, I'm going to sort of pull back and say, okay, this is really way too hard. So really, we're just going to focus on how can we support governance experimentation in online communities, because this part, it's a different set of problems. Let's put it this way. I've actually used to work in cities, working on sort of supporting like mayor, like the city of Boston, supporting the mayor, designing sort of like decision support systems for kind of these kind of like public leaders. And the problem is when you like work with these kinds of software and work with these kinds of entities, it's just everything moves so slowly. And there's so many kind of not quite vested interests, but just there's a lot of inertia in this field. And it's really hard to sort of experiment in the ways that you would like as a scientist or just as somebody who's trying to understand the world. So we're going to focus on online communities. I'm going to run through a really super brief social science primer and hope everybody kind of like already knows most of this stuff. But basically, if you haven't heard, governance, what is it? Well, it's at least partly about control. And what does that mean? You know, if you're on Facebook, for example, you know, reporting the post to group amends, you might be temporarily blocked if you post bad content, or if you actually like keep posting bad content and make racist comments, the police might actually come visit you, right? So there's a series of punishments and enforcement to run there. So governance, at least, is about laws in this sense, but it's also about norms, markets, and at the end of the day, code. And for those of you who are familiar with Code 2.0, this is exactly the classification that Lawrence Lessig uses, Lessig being kind of my one of the collaborators on the MetaGovernance project. So from the standpoint of control, governance is about laws, norms, markets, and code, or what we also call architecture. This is a particular theory of governance. Doesn't have to be your theory, but it's a nice way of organizing different modalities for regulating people. But in this case, just to go through a quick example, we're going to talk about governing an actual piece of code. And what is that like? So here's a whole rundown of different ways in which code might be governed. So at the very bottom, there are like basic resource constraints, CPU, latency, async memory, goes up to things like formal verification. That's like where the math comes in, as well as once we get to the kind of like leave the local space around like a typical programmer, and you jump into the governance of code, you know, where we're talking about like teams, right? There are like bug reports, there's requirements and software spec that usually gets issued that governs, you know, what code actually gets written. And then this goes all the way up to the actual laws that typically, you know, people think of as governance, you know, like DMCA 1996, the GDPR regulations. But the point is, when you talk about governance and you try to understand the entire scope, you really should consider this entire sort of array of different ways in which a single object or a single behavior like code is actually governed. So another example, you know, Python language governance, right? This is actually a really interesting example if you've ever seen like the PEPs around this, but you know, Python is essentially governed through, at the top, through a software foundation, but that software foundation, it actually breaks down into several different things, a steering council, a core team, and then this document that kind of discusses the philosophy of the Python project that sort of guides people as they make commits. These are all relational, and there's really excellent historical overview that I'll kind of like just mention PEP 8016. If you just have time to Google that, it's just a really excellent resource on how the governance of Python has evolved. But more generally, like if you look at most open source governance, just by comparison, it's really just a license, which is obviously important. And then there's typically a benevolent dictator for life that runs the project and approves commits, as well as a typical README file. These are all components of governance that exist online in any typical open source project. Right? I'm going to skip this slide. Mostly going to slip this slide as well, but just to point out that beyond just the local, where people are like Python programmers are programming, and the relational sort of parts of governance, there's also the constitutional parts. So the things that say like, this is how decisions are going to be made within the steering council, how the core team runs their commit process, right? This is the kind of articulates the decision-making process of some sort of group of people, of a community. And that's like what we call the constitutional level. And maybe pointing out most online communities, and certainly most open source governance communities, really don't have much in the way of constitutional kind of descriptors. It's really kind of, you can think of this as like, well, okay, there's nothing there, or you can think of this as an opportunity, right? And this is an opportunity that a lot of people are exploring, including people in like the DAO and blockchain communities. So once again, constitutional decisions about rules about code, relational decisions about rules about code, and the local is just decisions about code. So at the end of the day, this is all about people, human people making decisions. Okay, and the reason for this is that, anyways, this is partly from my old slides about MetaGov, but here, the precise kind of idea is like, maybe this part can also be reasoned about in code. And this is kind of like part of that hypothesis that we have about building better experiments or better governance through code, and then using that to support additional experiments, allowing us to scale these things up. Okay, open source projects, I won't just really quickly go through this. One is governance writ large. Governance writ small is about control, but governance writ large, if you sort of like read between the lines of sort of like all these different examples, is about designing for collective action. And an institution or a governance system is a setting and design for collective action. Now, designing governance systems is extremely hard because it's dealing with people and it's operating at all these different layers that we kind of gestured at in these examples. In the real world, you can't just plug wires in each other like you're building code. People have to design and really often evolve their own games. And I always like to end on this lovely quote by Margaret Hagan, who's also at Stanford. It is more fun to craft these visual and human parts of policy, like how things are organized, how institutions work, but it's really exhausting and contentious to get text exactly right. And that's really where most governance processes happen. It's a deeply, in some sense, how do I say it? It's an often unsexy and, as Margaret says, exhausting process. So how can we make that better, or how can we change that? And I see a lot of people nodding because I'm sure they've experienced just how annoying and exhausting it can be to disagree with people and work through all those disagreements to some form of compromise. Okay, so jumping back to the question, how can we support online experimentation, online communities? And here I'm going to just start running with just jumping a little bit faster. Well, at least maybe we can start by kind of trying to understand how experiments in general, or in this case in physics, are run. So background, actually, maybe a little bit, I actually come from, funnily enough, so there's another group doing quantum computing, right? I'm actually based in the same lab as one of those folks. So yeah, we get a lot of lectures about how experiments should be run in the sense of the quantum mechanics and physics. And I always thought like, oh, what a great kind of like comparison for how shitty governance, experimentation is designed or run in governance, right? So anyways, let's understand, like, this is from like an amazing physicist who is sort of asking himself like, okay, what's going on with physics today? Like, why are all these experiments that we're running kind of like useless? Like the vast majority of experimental physics papers are kind of pointless. And he gives like, okay, goes back to the basic principles and asks like, what are some great reasons for running a physics experiment? Well, maybe we don't know what we'll find. That's typically not true anymore in physics. We do often know what we will find. It's called the standard model. We can adjudicate between competing theories, like, I don't know, M theory and some other form of string theory. We can identify phenomena that exist for explanation in the current theoretical paradigm. And these are the best reasons, according to Robert Beckens, a physicist, of why we should run experiments. Less good, but still valid reasons, according to him, is that doing it improves our own understanding. So like when we run an experiment, an experimentalist, we understand better, how this thing works. And it helps us develop technology based on that theory. Now, I'm going to go over this later, but I just want to make sure, like, this is how physics sort of currently answers this question, but it's not necessarily what we don't necessarily have to take this as a model for how to run experiments in governance. Beckens also has this really, like, I love this graphic or this kind of diagram, because it's really pointing out this is how physics at large works, and how 3 different traditions in physics interact to produce like the amazing successes that we sort of think of when we think of like 20th century physics, right? There's what he calls realists, but really people who are building models. There are the empiricists, and by this really he means like people like analyzing and trying to understand data. And then pragmatists who are actually running the experiments with these like fancy atomic symbols, right? And I guess the thing I want to sort of point out here is there's a relationship between the people who are building the models, because the data offers constraints on these models, but also these models suggest different kind of experimental setups, right? But the pragmatists who are actually running experiments, these experimentalists, the data can help them develop technologies and supports that, but also, the observations here, which are not necessarily formalized, can also lead to certain kinds of axiomatizations. So there's the kind of this interplay between these different traditions in physics, in this part of science, that I think we can probably all agree don't precisely exist in governance or in large parts of the social sciences. So one of the questions I want to ask or pose for discussion today is like, why should we run a governance experiment? Just like really simply, like, why do we want to run this? Like, what are we trying to learn? Or what are we trying to do, right? And for me, at least, when I think about governance experiments, it's usually because I actually don't know what I'm going to find. I don't know what the conclusion of that is going to be. And I guess also because maybe I'm a pragmatist, I want to develop technology based on that theory. But these might not be your reasons. But I just want to offer this as a framework for when we sort of come back to this later to discuss, well, why do we want to run governance experiments? What are we trying to learn? What are you trying to do? And what informs experimental design and governance? I'm just going to leave this as a big question mark. I just want to point out, actually, there are lots of formal models of governance. There are data of various sorts living on different online platforms, at least. And there are pragmatic governance experiments being run in lots of different places. And I'll kind of go into this briefly later. But what is the connection between all these 3 strands or traditions? How do these form into a field? And the answer is, at least to me, they don't right now. But maybe that could change in the future. Maybe that would really make the world a much better place. Maybe governance could be the new physics of the 21st century. I don't know. So let's jump to the pragmatists, because I think that's like the most developed tradition in governance right now. And I want to sort of give you some examples of what I mean when I talk about online governance. I apologize, I probably should have put this way earlier in the presentation. But of course, there's blockchain governance, right? And really a way of summarizing this, like all the different consensus protocols, is they're kind of different ways, different code-based ways of generating legitimacy. We can develop that or follow up on that sort of later. DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. Most of the experiments happening in the DAO space really just take the form of, instead of a company, why don't you use a DAO to do X, right? To manufacture this or build this application or build this kind of software. There's implicitly, DAOs should be supporting us sort of decentralized forms of governance, but it's just important to point out this is actually not the case for the vast majority of DAOs. They're still relatively like small groups of people being operated by or controlled by relatively small amounts of people. There's obviously lots of sort of experiments and smart contracts that I think other people may actually, even in this room, may be more able to sort of talk about. These kind of revolve, at least to me, the most interesting ones revolve around constructing of applications built on kind of this transparent blockchain, like Decentraland, for example, as well as like various DeFi services. In MMOs, this is more my specialty. So there's a lot of really interesting kind of virtual economic design and fine tuning, including like fine tuning at the order of like every hour or every day. This video game will fine tune the parameters of the thing to make like the game easier or slightly harder, and thus make more money, right? There are lots of experiments, and you probably know most about this in social networks, experiments, control, and attention hacking. These are some of the worrisome developments in governance that we see today, as well as just a million different social apps, including, I think, one of the ones that literally was just somebody plugged in earlier in the call, right? But there's a lot more that we're missing, and especially that we're missing in the sort of realm of self-governance. As you'll notice, that a lot of these examples that we see today really revolve around some sort of central actor doing like A/B testing of some sort of feature or some sort of new design or incentive mechanism, usually coming from above. But very rarely do we see governance experimentation coming from below in a kind of like citizen science form. And that's really kind of a shame. So, I guess I'm kind of revealing my cards here, but like I'm most interested in supporting governance experimentation from below. How can we support building of new governance applications, new incentive schemes, new ways in which people can agree or sort of come together and sort of make collective decisions from themselves? How can we give them tools to innovate? But that, once again, may not be your answer. So how can we support governance tradition, or how can we develop a more experimental tradition of governance? And this is honestly my last slide, I apologize. So some answers: we can build rigorous models and theories of governance. And I'm going to here gesture to CAD for those of you who are familiar with this, or compositional game theory. This is a kind of mode of mathematics what we're using. We're piloting in MetaGov. We might facilitate sharing and integration of data, policies, and parameters across different communities and platforms. So this is something, these are experiments that we're producing or pursuing through a project at MetaGov called GovBase, which is the open community, open data set of online governance, as well as through MetaGov itself, or MetaGov, the tool, which is meant to support interoperability between different communities, platforms, even when they're built on different code bases. You might want more communicative or transparent policymaking. This is experiments being piloted by one of my collaborators, Amy Zhang, at University of Washington, through a product she calls Policy Kit. Or you might want to emphasize emergent possibilities through P2P interactions, like agreements and contracts. Obviously, smart contracts facilitates this to some degree, as well as sort of like tools like Claros and how was it, Celerity? It's one of the Hive projects. But it's also something we're kind of exploring through a project called the Agreement Engine. Resist purely technological and formal approaches. I actually really want to emphasize this, especially to this audience. And this is something that is currently being developed under the sort of context of executional theory by Primavera de Filippi, who's also involved in MetaGov. And just to sort of like close out some ideas, maybe we could use a more consistent or standardized methodology for running these experiments. Really, this is like, how do we build a standard for these things? And just generally more outreach and education about governance. And the last one sounds maybe the least sexy, but possibly is the most important.
To 6 a little bit more there. I really didn't understand what you were trying to say there.
Sure. So I think, especially like, let's say the Foresight Institute, right? Like a lot of the conversations that I sort of participated in and hear in Foresight, or kind of revolve around like, why don't we use AI to do this? Or why don't we use blockchain to do that, right? And the problem with this is that it kind of, well, there's kind of two problems with this. One, it skips over a lot of the, like, how do I say it? The hard nitty gritty things of like a bunch of people in a Zoom room trying to make a decision, or a bunch of people in a Telegram channel trying to make a decision. And oftentimes like the nitty grittiness of the decisions they need to make, like about text or about how to run this thing just a little bit differently versus that thing, right? And this is where like the stage of governance, in some sense, that a lot of the formal approaches like can't necessarily get into. You just design these like fancy formal architectures, and then you miss out on like the personal. What I would also sort of emphasize is that there are like normative, like communities are not just based on architectures or code. Code is a form of architecture. It's building like the spaces in which people interact. There's also this kind of like social architecture, or what we usually call norms, right? And this is kind of like, and sometimes a lot of communities, including communities that I work with on a kind of regular basis, when I sort of like go inside and sort of talk to them about how to build governance for themselves, they're really resistant against these formal approaches, and they really want to keep the normative structures and the way, the kind of like how do I say, the fluid way in which they govern themselves through norms, through sort of culture, right? They don't want to replace that, where they're resistant against replacing that with some sort of either sort of formal institution that could be just like a formal rule set, or even, or especially like, some sort of like code-based thing, right? It's sort of like when you were introducing a piece of technology or like a platform to your company, it's like, it just like takes a while to sort of get people to onboard people onto a piece of technology. And the same thing applies to these new forms of governance. Hopefully that, was a
Yeah, that
useful.
was very clear the second time, and I couldn't agree more.
Okay, sweet. All right, so that was my last content. This is just a kind of brief review of the different questions that were raised in this sort of preparatory introductory talk. So like, one, how do we support governance experimentation? What are some of the reasons that we have for running governance experiments? What informs experimental design and governance? And lastly, maybe how do we develop more of a tradition in governance around experimentation? Also, and these don't have to be your questions, feel free to just go wild and sort of like pose interesting thoughts and ideas that you currently have. Yeah, just let's have some fun.
Josh, I'm currently working on number 4, 7, 6, and 8. So I'm both developing the methodology and I'm also testing it. So I'm a social entrepreneur. I'm not coming out of the university world.
That's awesome. Could you tell us maybe a little bit more about like what you mean by that?
Yeah. So my methodology, this is the ground truth part. Politics 4.0. So 1.0 is violence. 2.0 is either or, the two-party system. I'm right, you're wrong. Politics 3.0 is biased third choices, where simply special interest groups are using whatever powers and tools that they have at their disposal to get their idea to be the one that gets implemented. But there are winners and losers. And politics 4.0 is the actual core methodology. So it's based on one sentence. There's a time to save and a time to spend. There's a time for freedom and a time for laws. Where can we agree? Where can we agree? So that inverts the problem of public policy that we're having right now based on the model of who gets what and when, which is basically where we live today. Everybody's fighting over the piece of a pie. And they have their own narratives. They have 4 separate narratives because there's 4 sides to the table. And what we're trying to do is if you start at where we can agree, that would be first principle. So first principle of public policy creation is, why don't we start where we can agree before we start fighting with each other? And I've been proofing out this model for over 5 years. And it actually works really, really, really well. It turns out that people don't actually have these strong held views. We're just told that we have strong held views. And when you actually start digging down into the actual nitty gritty of any particular public policy puzzle, as it turns out, we all, well, I say all, 70 to 80% of us can agree on tons of stuff. So I'm working on that methodology, and I've got tools, and we're about to publish a paper with the World Bank on narrative form creation and using it for the first solution, which was to involuntary poverty through conditional cash transfers. And we're about to publish on drug harm reduction, immigration, involuntary homelessness, and I'm forgetting one. So anyway, this is the space that I'm working in, and but it's hard. right? So I don't find that the work is hard. The tech side is difficult. You know, I'm bootstrapping this, so I mean everything takes too long. It doesn't come out right the first time. You know, maybe I chose the right architecture, maybe I didn't. You know, this isn't right, this isn't wrong. This cycle time is a month, not a day. You know, so this is the problem with experimentation, right? It's like it's pain, it's brutal.
I can absolutely sympathize with the coding tech. But let me draw on maybe two strands from that. One was, so this idea of finding consensus, right? Have you heard of like a platform called poll.is
Um,
or
I think
Polis?
so. I think so. But yeah, I think that the difference between us and them
Mhm.
is that they don't have the methodology. So it's kind of broken from the start. That's the problem with every other project that I've seen in this space, because what it is, it's politics 3.0. We're going to find a clever way to make our bias solution the one that wins. That's not consensus. That's fighting. If you get to a majority of each of the four sides of the table, it's hard to make an argument that that's biased. It's really hard to make that case. A majority from each of the four sides of the table, not a simple majority. That's three wolves and a sheep voting on dinner.
So I think there are, yeah, so it's absolutely true that like Paulus institutes a specific form of governance, right? In a sense of like, this is a specific form of like, say, either decision making or just like information extraction, right? And in that sense, it does impose in some sense like that form of governance. It may not be the right one. That said, it does have the similar goal of seeking consensus, right? In the sense that it's all about sort of like organizing people and using sort of like making discrete choices in order to foster like a consensus-based approach, as opposed to some other one. Now, drawing on this, like the second thread, that I think is really interesting that you sort of brought up when, you know, like there's a time, I think you said like there's a time for laws and there's a time for freedom. And I would think of this as like, maybe this isn't exactly what you're thinking about, like, you know, to me, that sounds like a kind of form of constitutional change, right? Or how do I facilitate?
No. We're just trying to find out what we can agree on before we start fighting. That's all. Just what can we, it's news, it's public policy. It's a menu of good public policy choices. The polis fatal flaw is that it's only for the people who show up in the room. It's always the liberals. What are you going to get? Oh, liberal solution. So half the table is not even playing in the game. And now because it's democratic, we decided we're going to force our will on you. That's politics 2.0. We didn't actually sit down at a table, the four sides, and decide what we can agree on.
But, okay, so, okay, maybe instead of me replying to that, maybe Jim, do you have, give other people a chance to sort of jump in? I see a hand raised. Jim and then John.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I wanted, taking off on the last piece, share with you that about 10 years ago, a group of people who recognized that they did not agree on pretty much anything in the Adirondack Park in upstate New York came together to form what they called the Common Ground Alliance. And this is exactly the model that was just being discussed. The purpose was to take environmentalists, some business people, some economic development people, and heads of small government towns and villages who recognized that they were constantly at each other's necks and constantly fighting, came together and set as a goal to find things that they could agree upon to build a commonality of agreement, hence the name, the Common Ground Alliance. And it has a core group of 4 or 5 people, and once a year, about 150 or 200 people from all over the Adirondack Park, which is a large 10,000 square mile area, come together to try to address and come to agreement on solutions of problems. And I would say to you that unequivocally, the outcome is that people, individuals within the group, come together throughout the year to try and work together on issues that are of common interest, but maybe not common agreement. But if you asked for a list of the successes, you would be hard pressed to find them because they're secondary or tertiary successes. We need to go to the state capitol and we need to figure out how to get some money, and we want to do this way. And they're not directly identified as coming from the Common Ground Alliance, but I think that many, probably most of the people who participate, recognize that the success is that there is less distrust, maybe even little distrust, and an effort to find things we agree on as a problem and we agree on as a solution. So I share it with the group because it's been around for 10 years. If you want, I'll tell you that it's currently what the current threat is to the group, but I'll stop.
John, I think you had a comment.
I can go next. Yeah. I really like what John is saying and what Jim just said. And in the small world department, I was actually part of that initial group 10 years ago in the Adirondacks. And I edited some of the material that went into the initial scenarios, and I trained the citizen facilitators for the first of several workshops to do that. So it's a great project. I'm very familiar with it, and I'm very happy to know that it is still going on after all this time without big external funding, which is one measure of success. Now, just to take that second issue and also connect this to what John was saying. But by the way, John, everything you're saying, I support and I like the way you're going at it. And I wouldn't want to try to distract you from going at it the way you are going at it, which I think is good. But just to expand the discussion, just in my imagination, if I imagine a meeting about involuntary homelessness, I'm going to get people to show up who are closer to being ready to consider action than if I run a meeting on, say, the future of the Adirondack Park, which is much more open-ended and could go in so many directions. And so there's a big difference in the policy area that's under consideration in terms of how focused, how ready people are to understand it and to articulate what they think. So the looking for agreement gets kind of challenging. And in that, I'm in a lot of well-intentioned Zoom groups where people want to think out loud and they want to be heard. And this is a very understandable, admirable human trait. However, in a group of 30 meeting every week, if everybody wants to think out loud and be heard, it bogs down. It bogs down because people are trying to figure out what they mean and what is the definition. You know what it's like. It goes on and on. So some of the people that I do that with, and I'm in 4 or 5 of these things a week, we're experimenting. We're saying, well, here's the constitutional proposition. Somebody gets to talk for 10 minutes, then we have to go to breakouts, and they have to be, they're time limited, and there has to be a report out. And we know we're squashing process, but what we're doing is we're allowing more people to be heard. We're allowing more people to talk aloud and get closer to what they think. And we do have a process that brings it back together. So we're trying to get people comfortable with that. And these are, sometimes they're academics and researchers, and they're people who are used to going on and on, about their work. So that's the challenge. It's a challenge in process. I'm not suggesting this in any way like as an alternative to what John is doing. I think that's great, but it's an expansion. It's another kind of work that might need to be done. And I know, Joshua, this takes it a little off the Well, actually, it's not off the online, because all these groups I'm talking about, they're all Zoom groups. We're all online, and we are you know, trying to articulate what do we mean, what are the implications, what are the risks of looking at it that way, and then ultimately, eventually, are we any closer to a governance type decision? So
That was amazing. Thanks so much for that contribution, John.
okay.
I can just say, first off, before I jump in, there's John, Sean, did I see people making a signal to respond, or? Okay.
Yeah, if I can just respond briefly here. Love what, sorry, took me a while to find this conversation among the others. What I heard of what John was saying, what the Johns were saying, I really endorse. Yeah, absolutely. This business of, okay, so to introduce myself, I'm a software developer and have been working on a longitudinal R&D project to develop a semantic platform to support human collective cognition. So the idea is basically a platform to facilitate those burrs to deal with issues like John, as John Kelly identified, this business about, hey, how do we deal with the parallelism of everybody's ambition to express themselves? How do we deal with the problem of alignment of terminology so that we can have clarity about what it is that we're talking about? And what John Den is talking about, this business about how do we discover what values, what things we have in common, so that we can find that core of commonality, and then work out from that core of commonality to discover what the impediments to growing that core of consensus are. And so this is all done in a way that basically sees to it that there's the concepts that come up are cataloged in a knowledge representation system, so that there's a machine understanding aspect that basically supports the emerging collective human cognitive process. Over.
That is beautiful. I am just going through your website right now, looking forward to seeing like what the fruits of that development. Actually, you know, this is kind of perfect, and actually extremely in line with how do I say it? The subject of the conversation. I guess the questions I kind of put up on the screen before, and I kind of want to ask. So you all, the three of you, have each of you experience or building some sort of governance experiment, right? But you're working on different aspects of governance, it seems. Like John without the H, first John, is building kind of more trying to experiment with a methodology, right? It sounds John with the H is experimenting kind of at a kind of ground at a pragmatic level, right? Where he's like going into these groups and like as a group from like, you know, kind of a grassroots bottom up perspective, trying to build, you know, like let's try with this like way of running the meeting or this other way of running the meeting, like maybe this will work better, right? And it's like a slow, painstaking process, but it's also like where, you know, you really interact with people where like governance is actually practice. And finally, Sean, this kind of sounds like John. Sean is working on like technology to support this entire process, right? Technology that will hopefully enter somewhere, either like maybe it's using this some sort of methodology and then applied in a practical setting, right? So I guess the question I have, and the thing that I see over and over and over again is, you know, people really want to make a difference in like in governance in their societies, right? By changing how that society works, we can all see the problems because the problems are like everywhere. But how do we make use or connect to each other in a kind of like some sort of scalable way, right? How can, both of the John's insights, like how can that contribute to what Sean is doing? How can what Sean is doing be scaled up and deployed and then like actually tested in some sort of like straightforward or easy way, right? Like that to me is like, because there's like, I had the wonderful experience of trying to collect all the voting software that exists online, and there is essentially infinite. You can go on GitHub. I mean, it's in some sense relatively trivial to build a voting software. You can see millions of these things on GitHub, most of which are, have been essentially like inactive for like 8 years or more, right? But somehow, like you notice, go through the data, it's like there was this massive explosion of this stuff, at least on GitHub, like starting around like, like 6 to 8 years ago, because people were really engaged, and especially people with technical skills were really engaged in developing this stuff. And at least the technical skills people, like they leave around traces that you can track. Whereas the work that I think that John with an H is doing, like it's less easy to track, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, like, are there ways in which we can make all our workflows and our efforts like better? How can we connect each other in a more sort of like in a better way so that we can really like, how do I say it, build better societies and better communities for everybody, right? How do we make use of all the efforts and all the sort of ideas that are coming and sort of flowing out and sort of being tested in all these different local communities with specific, or these specific methodologies, right? Okay, I've closed rant. I see John, maybe Rick, or maybe Rick was just scratching his head. John, why don't you
Okay,
go for
well,
it?
a couple of the groups that I belong to are spin-offs of something called Open Global Mind, which was started by Jerry Mikulski. Do you know about it, Joshua?
I do know about James Mikulski, Open Global Mind, I think.
Open Global Mind, yeah. So we've had some of these kind of rich, fascinating, doesn't go anywhere fast enough conversations, okay? Really smart people, very, very articulate. And people come and go, and some people very high level positions, Carnegie Institute, whatever, Stanford. Other people, move in and out. And to the side of those discussions, there's another discussion that takes place on Monday, which is, wait a minute. We need to do kind of like what Sean is talking about. So there's another group that's of Open Global Mind that meets on Mondays that talks about, okay, we have Mattermost, we have Massive Wiki, and they're actually trying to build tools to connect, not just, I don't know. I don't want to presume that I understand fully what Sean's doing, but it seems very similar in the sense of trying to make it more possible for people to understand the ways in which people are using terms and understand the trace of the policy or other kinds of proposals. How did we get to this thought, and how can you come in from outside and follow along and then join here if that's the decision that you make? Here are the things we're pretty much agreeing with, and here are the things we're working on and we don't agree with them, and you come into one of those if you want. So I'm not recommending that to this group. One of the things we struggle with in Open Global Mind is that the kind of people who are drawn to this are oversubscribed. We all have a lot of people knocking on our door and a lot of people going, oh. So I just want to mention it, with that caution. If you want a shorthand version, I would be perfectly happy to be the person who tells Foresight or tells you, Joshua, what Open Global Mind is up to, and when they are at a point where it's like, okay, they're getting close to a product set. Now come and take a look. But anybody who wants to come in, I'll give you the link. You can come on in, but I got to tell you, it's going to be slow. Come into the discussion. All right.
Completely fair. I guess what I want to point out though is that yes, governance innovation or governance discovery is slow, but like the discoveries that you're making at Open Global Minds, I feel those could be incredibly valuable, because like there's so many communities out there, right? And they're all going through similar learning experiences, especially as they like navigate this new online space and how social interactions happen online, right? So yeah, I would absolutely love to sort of stay in touch and sort of like just hear like what are the discoveries. And I guess the disclaimer is that I'm building a database specifically to kind of try to track some of these developments and to track sort of like changes in governance and how that sort of occurs across communities to sort of allow this kind of portability. But that's spectacular. So we're running around 50 minutes before the hour. So I want to give people who have not spoken yet a chance to kind of jump in. You don't have to sort of follow up, just like if you have a question or an observation or just a feeling, please feel to emote.
I'll talk
This
a
is
second
Rick.
here. Oh, go right ahead, Rick.
So I have no expertise in this field. First caveat, but I have to say that a country that could elect a pathological liar and narcissist to be president is a long ways from being able to reach for the things you people are doing, which is great work, all this development in how governance could be, powerful tools, different ways of thinking. Let's find out where, what our points of agreement are. This is all great stuff. And it's embedded in a country and a world that is polarized and increasingly polarized. And I am concerned and disturbed that although we are getting better, we are not getting better fast enough, considering the existential scale problems we're up against. Thanks.
That's a really big question. And I'm not sure if I have, honestly, like a sufficient answer to that. Sean, seem like you might have one?
Well, oh God, I agree with you, Rick, that it's absolutely appalling that this kind of nonsense is going on. But so much of this polarization, I would suggest, is a function of there being entities in the world that are motivated by there being such polarization, that are actually motivated by the hollowing out of the middle. It sells newspapers. It concentrates powers into the two ends of the two-party system. Yeah, there are lots of great reasons for it, but that's precisely what. And also another factor is the extreme frustration that everybody has with the ongoing failure of American and North American society in general to manage to find a path to rediscover a path to some kind of consensus. And so, yeah, it's those ongoing failures that I think are actually driving, in many ways, the polarization. It's the frustration with the institutions at hand. Or,
If I could chime in, because I have four sides, we get the wonder of weighted averages. And because there are weighted averages, we can actually have a scoreboard of solutions. And here's the problem, Rick, I think that I see from your comments is that there is not a trusted source of public policy leadership news available, period. Where can you go to rank all the best solutions for any problem we have in society? Where's the one place you can go to see them scored fairly, honestly, epistemically, and popularly? If that existed, at some point it would have to probably get popular. The problem is there's probably a critical amount of money that would be needed to get it to F1, to take off. Right? So that's what I'm chasing, is that there's not a place you can go to say, what's the best way to solve X? And here are 3 solutions, and one scored 81, and one scored 79, and one scored 76. Which one of those 3 do you think we should do? So the theory of second best says frequently the number 1 rated solution actually isn't the best one because it has some downside. This is a form of de Bono's lateral thinking, the 6 thinking hats. So sometimes the highest scoring idea might have also the highest scoring possible risk. And the second best idea actually is almost as good, but doesn't have the risk. So where is this being discussed? In fact, I'll turn it upside down. How could there not be a place to go to find ideas fairly and honestly ranked without putting a thumb on the scale? There isn't one. It
I don't
doesn't
know that
exist.
you're not putting your thumb on the scale, John.
The law of large numbers will allow for asymmetrical decision-making and averaging out all of the different teams that are doing the rating. And it's very hard to game the law of large numbers using the same methodology. It can be done. You can game it,
but what's producing the numbers? People, right? People are producing like the things.
Mhm.
So, but okay,
Yes,
so if
but
it's people,
it's calibrated. It's not 4 liberals showing up and telling conservatives what they're going to do. It's like it's 2 conservatives and 2 liberals getting together and deciding what to do. So calibrated teams is what's happening with, there's a book called How to Measure Anything. And there's pretty good science behind calibrated teams making good decisions. Rick's trying to jump in here.
Yeah, the law of large numbers is actually mathematically correct only in one dimension. When you have 2 dimensions such as risk and profit and the social good and even more dimensions, right?
That's virtually my model, what you just did.
Okay. Then the law of large numbers does not necessarily converge on a nice bell-shaped distribution because there's multiple dimensions. And at the end of bringing a whole lot of players or data points in these 3 axes together, you don't get a neat distribution. You get multiple clumps in 3D space, 4D space, whatever.
But is that better than what we have now?
Almost anything is better than what we have. Oh, and along those lines, I do want to say, you know, there's a whole lot of flack against the 2-party system because it creates a whole lot of distortions. If you pay attention to other countries, multi-party systems and parliamentary systems have their own collection of grief.
So just quickly, this is not an answer to the problem, but this is a illustration of a step along the way to an answer. And it goes back to that project that Jim brought in and I worked on at the beginning. There's actually a website. It's called adkfutures.net. And that's the data site for the bottoms-up scenario planning that was done iteratively in the Adirondacks and is still going on. People are still creating events and checking events. And so what is it? Is it voting for what's the best policy? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. What people are voting on is what seems most likely. Where is there a dependency? Do we think that this this version of the future is more or less dependent on these factors. So it's an enabling kind of consideration. It doesn't point to a policy solution, but if people were going to get together and discuss a policy solution and they had the opportunity to go over that stuff, they might think differently about it. And the fact that it's still in use, and you know, I picked it off, I helped kick it off in 2012. The fact that it's still in use is kind of interesting because it kind of suggests that people are finding it as a useful precursor to their current policy discussions.
Jim.
So first of all, I have the camera off because I had some minor surgery and I'm all bandaged up, but I didn't want to scare all of you. And John, my last name is Sonoborn, and I think we met somewhere along the way 10 years ago or so.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting current situation because in the next year is going to be really interesting. An outside force, I'll be vague about it, is attempting to sort of wrest control of this away from all of the people who are doing it. And I'm working as best I can, as well as I can, to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I think we'll regain control of it. But it is working. It has worked really well in allowing for example, the largest environmental group CEO to be able to pick up the phone and call the head of the sort of the lead elected official from the towns and villages, and they can go in and have coffee and talk and find common ground. It really is, you should be pleased to know, continuing to work. If I can have just one more minute, because I want to share a different model that I've had very little contact with, and some of you may know a great deal about this, but I did some work many years ago with the Onondaga Nation, located a little south of Syracuse, and I learned that, first of all, only women elect the chiefs and only men are chiefs. Only women inherit, the eldest daughter inherits all of the land, and they meet in the longhouse and make decisions by consensus. Everyone must agree before a new law is passed, but no one can unreasonably withhold their agreement. Just, if you think about that in our society, you need to understand one more thing, which is, as a Native American said to me, you people think of forests in decades, and we think of forests in centuries.
I just say that as a remarkably beautiful way of ending this this conversation. I think, how do I say it? Maybe just to cap a little bit. Yeah, what Jim and John kind of like references, it seems like there's a lot of beauty and a lot of kind of like fabulous, inventive, effective governance that's happening in various local levels, whether in longhouses or in specific communities around specific local systems. And people are able to find these solutions through a little bit of like, testing and sort of like maybe a long series of testing and sort of experimentation. But somehow, for whatever reason, those successes are not translating to the national level that Rick sort of is deeply concerned by. So why is that not happening? How can we change that? I think those are questions that, disturb me, make me wake up at night. But I hope, just through continued conversation, we'll be able to make some progress on those things bit by bit.
So I will say very, very briefly, the cynical answer to that is the iron law of oligarchy. Every system becomes a system where the wealthy and powerful use their power to get more wealth and power.
Rick, you must have some hope, or you wouldn't be here. So where do you see hope?
You're going to love this one. I see hope in the rather small chance that we can build a super intelligent coach for humanity.
I would say that the situation we're in is best described by the term world problematique, where there's this collection of interacting, mutually protecting problems. So problems that are protecting one another from solution. And so it's like a pickup sticks game where you can't pull one out without causing the other because they're all tangled up with the others. And so the challenge is that we basically need to up level our capacity for collective thought and coordination for us to be able to become the beings organized in the structures sufficient to undoing this this world problematique. We need to evolve not only ourselves, but in effect, our noospheric infrastructure to be able to undo this challenge. Over.
Slight modification to the hope to have a super intelligent coach without accepting that that is either the goal or a possibility. There's some interesting historical examples. There's the Meiji Restoration in Japan, in which they were nominally bringing back and revering the emperor who had kind of been shoved aside by the previous dynasty. But the emperor was not really running things at all, was not really being brought back. He was being brought back as a device to smooth out some of the differences. And they did a lot of other really creative tricks, like paying off people who needed to be paid off in the form of bonds, the value of which would only be able to be realized if you started a business and invested. So a couple of really interesting ideas there. I'm actually working on a science fiction story in which it's a similar kind of thing. We bring back something that we revere from the past as if we were putting it in power, but we don't actually put it in power. We make it a ritual. And then underneath that ritual, solutions more of the type that John is working on and that other people are working on are allowed to take place and be implemented.
Maybe a tiny little bit of a reading for those who are interested, just because John was talking about the nature of those bonds. There's something actually quite similar that experiment people are trying to realize with the whole NFT and blockchain craze, which is essentially something similar. You buy these NFTs, and the idea is that they increase in value only when certain the global the millennium goals are satisfied, with the SDG goals, or carbon emissions go down, right? So there are tiny little tweaks, really quite creative solutions. I think if we add enough of them, maybe we can do something cool. Okay, all right. So to be clear, everybody's welcome to just hang out and chat and sort of continue the discussion. I have to run, but I think Guy may still be here and others may be. But it's really been a pleasure participating in this conversation with all of you. And I hope you guys will stay in touch, whether through MetaGov, just go to metagov.org, you can find out more, and participate in the seminars where we have talks. They're actually exactly similar to this, pretty much every week at, I think currently on Wednesdays at noon Eastern time. So feel free to just jump in some of those calls if any of the talks are interesting to you. All right, with that, it's been spectacular. Thank you so much for having me.
Great.